Welcome back. Let's talk about interpreters and compilers, which, as we can see, are important pieces in our JavaScript engine. You see, in programming, there are generally two ways of translating to machine language, or something that our computers can understand. And what we're going to talk about here actually applies to most programming languages, not just JavaScript. Python, Java, C++, any language you can think of is going to use some of these concepts. So it's very important. Let's start with the first one, the interpreter. With an interpreter, what we do is we translate and read the files line by line on the fly. Let's have a look at how this works. I have a piece of code here that, doesn't do very much, does it? I have a function that does some calculation, and we just loop over this calculation, which is 5 plus 4 right over here. And we do that, 1,000 times. That's a long time. And you see that we get the result 9 over here. But the loop is happening over and over. So if I go console.log here, we see that, this is looping over and over and over. Now, with an interpreter, if I give this file to an interpreter, the translation happens line by line on the fly. And this is how you think the code should be run, right? The interpreter sees the first line, then the second line, then the third line, and says, all right, this is a function. And then it goes to the next part and says, all right, I should loop over this a bunch of times, and it starts doing some calculation. It's going to go and see, all right, that's what the function is. I'm going to run 5 plus 4. And then I'm looping again. So I'm going to go once again, run some calculation 5 plus 4, some calculation 5 plus 4, and it keeps running, keeps running, keeps running. And this is how you might think code should be run, right? Because interpreting code simply means taking a set of instructions like we have over here and returning an answer and doing something with that code. It's just like me telling a computer to do this, then do that, then do this. And initially, that's how JavaScript worked. It was interpreting, using an interpreter, which makes sense. All right, but what about a compiler? What's the deal with a compiler? Well, a compiler, unlike an interpreter, doesn't translate on the fly. What it does is it works ahead of time to create a translation of what code we've just written, and it compiles down to usually a language that can be understood by our machines. Let's have a look at this in more detail. With a compiler, this time around, it's going to take one pass through the code and try to understand what the code does. And it's going to take the program in JavaScript or any type of language and write a new program in a new language. Let's say to programming language Y or X. And this language that it spits out, let's call it just X. Well, this language that it spits out, if we interpret it, this language that is going line by one at a time and running it, it's going to create the same results as our previous language. So a compiler tries to understand what we want to do and takes our language and changes it into something else. And this usually happens into something called a lower level language, such as machine code. Now, I know you're still a little bit confused. You see, the definition itself is actually a little bit fuzzy. In some respects, all languages have to be interpreted and compiled. Because it has to run, it has to be interpreted, and it also has to most likely get translated into something low level like machine code. For example, we have a high level language here like JavaScript, and we run a piece of code here. An interpreter will take this code line by line and spit out bytecode like this that will execute this code for us. Or a compiler might take this code and go through this and spit out machine code, just like that, so that it can give it to a CPU so that the CPU can actually run the code. But remember how I said a program or most languages are both compiled and interpreted? Because over here, x86 code, which is machine code, this is handed off to the CPU and it needs to interpret these instructions. And in reality, when it comes to x86, it's actually too slow to be interpreted literally. So instead, most modern CPUs will compile this x86 code into its own native microcode. So as you can see here, there's a lot of layers that happen on and on. But the main takeaways is this. There are two ways to run JavaScript, using an interpreter or a compiler. Now, I know it's still a little bit fuzzy, but if I ask you, why would we want to do one over the other? What are the pros and cons on each? What do you think that is? Why would you pick one over the other? In the next video, we're going to explore that. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye.